change. What kinds of things can be different? If you were looking at something, you were like, that is different.
Appearance.
Appearance. So color, size, shape. Are all of those capable of changing?
Yes.
Yes.
How about behavior? Can behavior change?
Yes.
When we say time then, how do we define time? Do these changes in behavior or appearance, color, size, shape, structure, do those things occur over short bits of time or long amounts of time? Typically long. Some behavioral changes I can prompt quite quickly, right? But you may revert back to habit. So change generally takes a long time. Up to this point in biology, we've taken the opportunity to discuss the great biodiversity of life. So the huge number of species that are out there. And the sum total of all of the ecosystems in which they live. That leads one to a natural question. Where did these things come from? And were they as they are now? Is that how they have always been, or have they changed? Now you guys, I have a feeling if I ask you those questions, will answer them in a very predictable fashion. So I'm going to do it. Answer them in the predictable fashion. Where did all the species come from? And, thinking about it, where did they come from?
Like from a scientific view, it came from a single cell. They all evolved from single cell organisms that were present with a mix of chemicals in the earth that reacted to form like amino acids.
So are you proposing that things have changed over time?
Yes.
Over a long time?
Yes.
How many of you are like, yes, I am comfortable with this explanation of change occurring over a long amount of time? How many of you are like, well, there's some words in there that I am uncomfortable with? Some words in there that I'm like, I don't know about this. So I will say, as we go through some of these words, I do have a couple things to tell you. If you are about to tell me that your chosen system of where things came from, rather than the scientific point of view, because you use the word scientific, right?
Yes.
Rather than a scientific point of view, you're going to take a theological point of view. I'm going to tell you, you don't have to pick or choose. You can, in fact, take both. And it's actually really easy how you take both. It's going to be delightful. You'll be like, I assure you now, in case you are nervous about the destination of your eternal soul, I am not leading you down the path as I have been accused before. I promise you I'm not trying to lead you down the path of atheism or any other denial of the existence of a divine power. So we're all clear. So instead I'll tell you, how people used to think. How many of you are like, Luke's explanation, his explanation is common knowledge. That is what the general public would tell you about where all these animals came from. Common knowledge? In 1820, how many of you are like, yeah, that was common knowledge? 1820, it's not all that long ago. Grand scheme of things, 1820 is, well, relatively recent, right? You guys are like, no, it's like Stone Age. What do you think they thought in the 1820s?
God created the world in 7 days, or 6 days, and rested on the seventh.
My favorite day was always the day of rest. Because, well, who doesn't like a day of rest? The theory to which you are referring is called the theory of special creation. If it were the 1820s, it would not be common knowledge, what we just discussed, because common knowledge would be that life is as it has always been. Now, I told this to last hour, and they were very skeptical. They were like, were people stupid? Like, I'm going to tell you what these people believed, and you're going to be like, that doesn't actually make any sense. So people at the time believed that everything on earth was immutable. I-M-M-U-T-A-B-L-E.
It turned off.
Well, that was inconsiderate of it. But thank you. And some things are better at competing than others. That's really very important. Some things are better at competing than others. If you add those two things together, the idea that Earth is really old and some things are better at competing than others, suddenly you have impetus for change. You have a reason for things to change. You don't have a how, but you have a why. And the how is how we ended up with this concept of evolution, that things change over time, and the amount of time is a very long time. And the first guy to kind of make any real famous explanation of it has an awesome name, at least I think it's awesome. His name is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And Jean-Baptiste Lamarck looks like this. Jean-Baptiste. French guy. That's how you end up with a name like Jean-Baptiste. You be French. He was named for somebody. Who did he get named for? Look carefully at his name. All together.
John the Baptist.
John the Baptist. He was named for John the Baptist. That tells you the era in which he's doing his work, right? It's an era in which parents give you very, very obvious names. That's a pretty obvious Christian association, if there ever was one. And he came out and said something that was super unpopular among the Christians at the time. Way to go. And we today call it Lamarckism. That's how most people will see it. It's how you'll see it in most textbooks. But technically, its proper name is not Lamarckism, but rather the theory of acquired characteristics. And he said, okay, Hutton, Lyell, Malthus, you all gave us this great explanation for why things are changing. Here's how they change. An organism acquires a characteristic which they pass on to their offspring. The acquired characteristic will help with survival. So it helps that whole Malthus thing. It helps you be better at surviving than something else. Now you guys are going to actually be thrilled that Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was wrong. And here's why you're going to be thrilled. How many of you have a parent who got a haircut that you really can't stand? Admit it, come on. How many of you have parents, well, okay, some of you might not want to admit this publicly, who have a tattoo that you are not a fan of? I had somebody in first hour be like, yeah. Think of it more before you were born. How many of you look at pictures of your parents before you were born and you're like, what were they thinking? Hair color, haircut, yeah, right? Lamarck's theory says that if your parent had a haircut before you were born, before you were conceived, they got this really great haircut that was so early 90s, and then they had you, you would have had that haircut because it was an acquired characteristic. It helped with their survival. Here's how it helped their survival. Well, surviving biologically means that you have a baby. That's what biological survival is. You assured their biological survival. How many of you are like, praise be to God, Lamarck was wrong? The same concept is Arnold Schwarzenegger's children all should have been super buff when they were born. How? Well, Arnold Schwarzenegger acquired some amazing pecs and biceps and triceps, right? Those are required, and he should then be able to pass them on to his offspring. This is where last hour was like, but didn't they see all of the counter examples of these things? I don't know. I don't know how they didn't. I'm assuming survival was hard enough that they didn't think too hard about this. Some of the evidence that was used to disprove his theory at the time, you guys know what a Doberman Pinscher is, the dog? Doberman Pinschers are often susceptible to tail breakage. They are all born with long tails. Their tails have to be surgically cropped because if they're wagging their tail and they hit it on something, then they break their tail. It's very easy to break them. It's very painful for the dog. So naturally we crop them when they're young, so they just have like that little stub, right? Adorable little stub. Problem with that, though, that means that every Doberman after that first surgery should be born without the tail. Same with the ears. They crop the tops of the ears so they won't break. Vets would never have to do that procedure again had Lamarck been correct. So we pretty quickly had some counter evidence to why the theory of acquired characteristics wasn't true. Again, Lamarckism, not true. His idea basically was to say, like, we got giraffes because, like, a horse-like thing stretched to get a leaf that was a little bit higher, and so its offspring were born with a little bit longer of a neck, and then over progressive generations, you ended up with giraffe and horse being two distinct things. It was one way to explain how we could have that kind of biodiversity. It's the same idea as, what is that silly story where like the elephant gets his nose stuck and then pulls and pulls and pulls and pulls, and that's how it gets a trunk. We know that's not how it works now. Over the course of the next few days without me, you guys are going to be learning about the scientist who developed a theory and all of his research and evidence that is the theory that we currently to this day accept. It is understood as the best running theory or explanation for how change over time occurs, and that theory is called natural selection. Same ideas, he uses the same evidence. He uses Malthus, he uses Hutton, he uses Lyell. He just interprets them slightly differently. So if you've ever heard of Charles Darwin, he'd be your winning guy so far. That was, he was like 1850s. So we fast forward a decade or two and think a little differently. Keeping in mind, at the time, he was still doing work that was frowned upon socially. His parents were really hoping he would follow in his father and grandfather's footsteps. While his grandfather was also a physician, they were preachers. They were ministers. And they were hoping that he too was going to be a preacher. but instead got on a boat and he sailed around the world. Preacher, sailing, preacher, sailing. I don't know. It's the quietest you've been ever. Have you given up talking today?
No, I just do for this semester.
Very confusing to me.
We have to turn these in. Yeah,
If you have your folder and we want to recycle it, we're going to collect them back in the file cabinet again and then organize them by hour later in, well, probably next week, honestly. So like I said, you guys aren't going to see me for, well, till next Monday. Sorry. Be good for yourself. It's hard enough for me to be out. It's way worse when I have to come back and, like,